The king of the fishes. Once upon a time there was a fisherman who was very poor and felt poorer still because he had no children. Now one day as he was fishing, he caught in his net the finest fish he had ever seen, the scales all gold and eyes as bright as diamonds. And just as he was going to take it out of the net, what do you think happened? The fish opened his jaws and said, "I am the king of the fishes, and if you throw me back into the water, you will never want to catch." The fisherman was so surprised that he let the fish slip into the water. He flapped his big tail and dived under the waves. When he got home, he told his wife all about it, and she said, "Oh, what a pity, I have had such a longing to eat such a fish." Well, next day the fisherman went again a-fishing, and sure enough, he caught the same fish again, and it said, "I am the king of the fishes. If you let me go, you shall always have your nets full." So the fisherman let him go again. And when he went back to his home, he told his wife that he had done so. She began to cry and wail and said, "I told you I wanted such a fish, and yet you let him go. I am sure you do not love me." The fisherman felt quite ashamed of himself and promised that if he caught the king of the fishes again, he would bring him home to his wife for her to cook. So the next day the fisherman went to the same place and caught the same fish the third time. But when the fish begged the fisherman to let him go, he told the king of the fishes what his wife had said and what he had promised her. "Well," said the king of the fishes, "if you must kill me, you must. But as you let me go twice, I will do this for you. When the wife cuts me up, throw some of my bones under the mare, and some of my bones under the dog, and the rest of my bones bury beneath the rose tree in the garden, and then you will see what you will see." So the fisherman took the king of the fishes home to his wife, to whom he told what the fish had said. And when she cut up the fish for cooking, they threw some of the bones under the mare, some under the dog, and the rest they buried under the rose tree in the garden. Now after a time, the fisherman's wife gave him 2 fine twin boys, whom they named George and Albert, each with a star on his forehead just under his hair. And at the same time the mare brought into the world 2 fine colts, and the dog 2 puppies. And under the rose tree grew up 2 rose bushes, each of which bore every year only 1 rose. But what a rose that was! It lasted through the summer, and it lasted through the winter, and most curious of all, when George fell ill, one of the roses began to wilt, and if Albert had an illness, the same thing happened with the other rose. Now when George and Albert grew up, they heard that a 7-headed dragon was ravaging the neighboring kingdom, and that the king had promised his daughter's hand to anyone that would free the land from this scourge. They both wanted to go and fight the dragon, but at last the twins agreed that George go and Albert stop at home and look after their father and mother, who had now grown old. So George took his horse and his dog and rode off where the dragon had last been seen. And when he came to Middlegard, the capital of the kingdom, he rode with his horse and his dog to the chief inn of the town, and asked the landlady why everything looked so gloomy, and why the houses were draped in black. "Have you not heard, sir?" asked the landlady. "The dragon with the 7 heads has been eating up a pure maiden every month, and now he demands that the princess herself shall be delivered up to him this day. That is why the town is draped in black, and we are all so gloomy." Thereupon George took his horse and his dog and rode out to where the princess was exposed to the coming of the dragon with 7 heads. And when the princess saw George with his horse and his sword and his dog, she asked him, "Why come you here, sir?" "Soon the dragon with 7 heads, whom none can withstand, will be here to claim me. Flee before it is too late." But George said, "Princess, a man can die once, and I will willingly try to save you from the dragon." Now as they were talking, a horrible roar rent the air, and the dragon with the 7 heads came towards the princess. But when it saw George, it called out, "Consent fight?" And George said, "If I can't, I can learn. I'll teach thee," said the dragon. And thereupon began a mighty combat between George and the dragon. And whenever the dragon came near to George, his dog would spring at one of his paws. And when one of the heads reared back to deal with it, George's horse would spring to that side, and George's sword would sweep that head away. And so, at last all the 7 heads of the dragon were shorn off by George's sword, and the princess was saved. And George opened the mouths of 7 of the dragon's heads and cut out the tongues. And the princess gave him her handkerchief, and he wrapped all the 7 tongues in it and put them away next to his heart. But George was so tired out by the fight that he lay down to sleep with his head in the princess's lap. And she parted his hair with her hands and saw the star on his brow. Meanwhile, the king's marshal, who was to have married the princess if he would slay the dragon, had been watching the fight from afar off. And when he saw that the dragon had been slain, and that George was lying asleep after the fight, he crept up behind the princess, and, drawing his dagger, said, "Put his head on the ground, or else I will slay thee." And when she had done that, he bade her rise and come with him after he had collected the 7 heads of the dragon and strung them on the leash of his whip. The princess would have wakened George, but the marshal threatened to kill her if she did. "If I cannot wed thee, he shall not." And then he made her swear that she would say that the marshal had slain the dragon with the 7 heads. And when the princess and the marshal came near the city, the king and his courtiers and all his people came out to meet them with great rejoicing. And the king said to his daughter, "Who saved thee?" And she said, "This man." "Then he shall marry thee," said the king. "I don't know, father," said the princess. "I am not old enough to marry yet. Give me, at any rate, a year and a day before the wedding takes place," for she hoped that George would come and save her from the wicked marshal. The king himself, who loved his daughter greatly, gave way at last and promised that she should not be married for a year and a day. When George awoke and saw the dead body and found the princess there no longer, he did not know what to make of it, but thought that she did not wish to marry a fisherman's son. So he mounted his horse, and with his faithful hound went on seeking further adventures through the world, and did not come that way again till a year had passed, when he rode into Middlegard again, and alighted at the same inn where he had stopped before. "How now, hostess?" he cried. "Last time I was here, the city was all in mourning, but now everything is agog with glee. Trumpets are blaring, lads and lasses are dancing round the trees, and every house has flags and banners flowing from its windows. What is happening?" "Know you not, sir," said the hostess, "that our princess marries tomorrow?" "Why, last time," he said, "she was going to be devoured by the dragon with 7 heads. "Nay, but he was slain by the king's marshal, who weds the princess tomorrow as a reward for his bravery. And everyone that wishes may join the wedding feast tonight in the king's castle." That night George went up to the king's castle and took his place at the table not far off from where sat the king with the princess on one side of him and the marshal on the other. And after the banquet the king called upon the marshal once more to tell how he had slain the dragon with the 7 heads, and the marshal told a long tale of how he had cut off the 7 heads of the dragon. And at the finish he ordered his squire to bring in a platter on which were the 7 heads. Then up rose George and spoke to the king and said, "And pray, my lord, how does it happen that the dragon's heads had no tongues?" And the king said, "That I know not." "Let us look and see." and the jaws of the dragons' heads were opened, and behold, there were no tongues in them. Then the king asked the marshal, "Know you aught of this?" And the marshal had nothing to say. The princess looked up and saw her champion again. Then George took out from his pocket the 7 tongues of the dragon, and it was found that they fitted. "What is the meaning of this, sir?" said the king. Then George told the story of how he had slain the dragon and fallen asleep in the princess's lap, and had awoken and found her gone. And the princess, when asked by her father, could not but tell of the treachery of the marshal. "Away with him," cried out the king. "Let his head be taken off, and his tongue be taken out, and let his place be taken by this young stranger." So George and the princess were married and lived happily, till one night, looking out of the window of the castle where they lived, George saw in the distance another castle with windows all lit up and shining like fire. And he asked the princess, his wife, what that castle might be. "Go not near that, George," said the princess, "for I have always heard that none who enters that castle ever comes out again." The next morning, George went with horse and hound to seek the castle. And when he got near it, he found at the gate an old dame with but one eye. And he asked her to open the gate, and she said she would, but that it was a custom of the castle that whoever entered had to drink a glass of wine before doing so. And she offered him a goblet full of wine. But when he had drunk it, he and his horse and his dog were all turned into stone. Just at the very moment when George was turned to stone, Albert, who had heard nothing of him, saw George's rose in the garden close up, and turned the color of marble. Then he knew that something had happened to his brother, and he had out his horse and his dog, and rode off to find out what had been George's fate. And he rode till he came to Middlegard, and as soon as he reached the gate, the guard of the gate said, "Your Highness, the princess has been in great anxiety about you. She will be so happy to know that you have returned safe." Albert said nothing but followed the guard until he came to the princess's chamber, and she ran to him and embraced him and cried out, "Oh, George, I am so delighted that you have come back safe." "Why should I not?" said Albert. "'Cause I feared that you had gone to that castle with flaming windows, from which nobody ever returns alive," said the princess. Then Albert guessed what had happened to George, and he soon made an excuse and went off again to seek the castle which the princess had pointed out from the window. When Albert got there, he found the same old dame sitting by the gate, and asked if he might go in and see the castle. She said again that none might enter the castle unless they had taken a glass of wine, and brought out the goblet of wine once more. Albert was about to drink it up when his faithful dog jumped up and spilt the wine, which he began to lap up, and as soon as he had drunk a little of it, his body turned to marble, just by the side of another stone which looked exactly the same. Then Albert guessed what had happened. Descending from his horse, he took out his sword and threatened the old witch that he would kill her unless she restored his brother to his proper shape. In fear and trembling, the old dame muttered something over the 4 stones in front of the castle, and George and his horse and his hound and Albert's dog became alive again as they were before. Then George and Albert rode back to the princess, who, when she saw them both so much alike, could not tell which was which. Then she remembered and went up to Albert and parted his hair on his forehead and saw there the star and said, "This is my George." But then George parted his own hair, and she saw the same star there. At last Albert told her all that had happened, and she knew her own husband again. And soon after, the king died, and George ruled in his place, and Albert married one of the neighboring princesses. The end.